Hi guys, Mark again, and we are here re-examining the end times through the lens of my 2024 book, The Threshold of Exile. We're in part 4. We're now in episode 42, and we're studying the book of Revelation, and we're looking to see how these things can be seen in the light of New Testament, or what might say first century history. I know it's very common today to look at all these prophetic events as being something that's far off into the future, or maybe even in our own time. I've said this in the past, that having been a child of the Jesus movement, we didn't believe that we would even see adulthood, and that was 50 years ago. And here I am, a 73-year-old grandfather, and I'm still here. And all that hasn't happened yet, in spite of all the promises and prophecies and predictions. We're still here, and that makes us wonder, when we look at the book of Revelation, and we're retracing our steps a little bit here, but I like to always set this context as that, if words mean anything, Revelation 1, we're told right from the start that these things must shortly come to pass. They must come to pass quickly. We're told again in Revelation 22 that these things must come to pass shortly. Jesus told his disciples in the Olivet Discourse that the things that were prophesied there that he told them about would all happen before that generation passed. And the question that was asked by the disciples had to do not with the end of the world as we understand, it was the end of the age. They were Jews. They had rabbinical understanding that they were given of this idea of two ages, the Olam Haba, which was the age to come that they were anticipating that would be brought in by Messiah, and then there was the Olam Haza, which is the age they lived in. And so when the Bible speaks of the coming age or the age to come, it's not speaking of something at the end of the world. It's speaking at the end of the Jewish world, a transition from the old covenant system with Judaism as the privileged company, the Jews as the privileged company and the privileged nation, and transitioning now to the body of the church under Christ, which, by the way, consists of both Jews and Gentiles. This is not something that transfers simply from Jews to Gentiles. No, the church is a Jew-Gentile body, and that all are welcomed into the community of faith who are willing to receive Christ. And so, as we've been traversing through the Revelation, we're now in chapter 12. We're starting chapter 12. We've seen this nearness of the events. Jesus is, of course, the initial vision of Christ himself in the midst of the churches, and then we see his messages to the churches. As we go forward, we see this great throne room vision of Christ being the Lamb and being slain and being worthy to unseal the visions, which I think what we might have seen is this unsealing of the visions the books of Daniel, the visions that Daniel was told to seal in chapters 8 and 12 of his work. And so Jesus is being given the privilege, this having been offered himself for us for sins, and he's earned this great privilege of breaking the seals. And in Revelation 6, the invasion, all that's pertaining to the judgment of Israel in the Old Covenant, under the Old Covenant, is about to begin. And those visions in Revelation 6 parallel the things that Jesus said would happen in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24. And so there's this parallel, and so we're still in what I think in line with what Jesus said would happen before that generation ended. And then in 7 we saw the preservation of the remnant. And then in 8 and 9, we got a glimpse of the infrastructure of the invasion, of how it passed from its initial visions of 1/3 of the land, which was the northern Galilean campaign of Vespasian, the Roman general, and then through the turmoil of some issues in the Roman government and the Roman system, which John doesn't deal with in 8 and 9. But we do see the transfer of the power of the invasion, or the leadership of the invasion, to Vespasian's son Titus. And Titus is the one who ultimately, who is the destroyer, and we'll get into that later, but he's the one who ultimately surrounds and attacks and invades and destroys Jerusalem, as Vespasian takes the role of emperor during that time as well. And so as moving forward, in 10 we have this interlude where we are told that there will be no longer any delay that this consummation is about to happen. This consummation, again, is not an end of the world, but it's the consummation of the Old Testament world and the arrival of the kingdom. And so 11, we have this assessment of the temple. We have this distinction between those who are temple people and priests, those who are measured and assessed as part of the inner court, those who have access to God, versus what's on the outside. And that outer court and the city will be trampled by the Gentiles for 3.5 years. And we learned also that kind of aligns with what Jesus said in Luke 21, that Jerusalem should be trampled under by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. And of course, that time would end when Jesus would come and establish his kingdom in his arrival in clouds of glory, of clouds of judgment, just as God has done in the Old Testament when he showed up on the scene in glory clouds. And that's a very consistent imagery that we see in the Old Testament, God showing up on the scene to take care of business in a cloud, and Jesus is just using Old Testament imagery. So, we're moving through this book, and we see this great consummation in 11. We see the resurrection of the dead. We see the kingdom being established. We see a covenant inauguration in verse 19 of Revelation 11, where there's thunder and lightning and the peals of thunder and an earthquake, and this is all reminiscent of the inauguration of the covenant in Exodus when God appeared on Mount Sinai, and we see all this kind of activity, and it's God inaugurating and giving the law and setting apart Israel as a people for his own purposes. So now, here seeing all that, and we now have a whole set of new visions to examine, and so we come to 12, and we're going to see kind of a new start. And just as chapter 6 of Revelation staging the vision and mirroring the Olivet Discourse, and it was focusing on the judgments coming upon Israel, this new set of visions that begins in verse 12, really, the church comes into view, struggling to be faithful in the face of persecution, in the face of the attacks of the great enemy, the dragon. We see great turmoil, tribulation, labor pains of the woman with child, and the great dragon trying to gobble up the man-child, and war in heaven. And so we see a lot of turmoil here. And so the scene turns somewhat toward the church and her behavior. And there's just amazing both historical as well as biblical parallels in these visions. And of course, in 12:1, it begins a great sign appearing in heaven. There's a woman who's clothed with the sun. Of course, that's this woman who we'll see is actually the New Jerusalem, the mother, the church's mother, as Paul describes her in Galatians 4. She's clothed with the sun. So this is not Israel that is now fallen. This is the church. This is a vision of the New Jerusalem, the woman who is clothed with the righteousness of Christ, the Son, and she has the moon under her feet, which is interesting. The moon would be kind of a secondary power, or what I would refer to as the law. She's got the law under her feet, and this kind of harkens back to earlier in Genesis, where we looked at how Joseph had the dream, and he says the sun, the moon, and the 12 stars were bowing down to him, and Jacob immediately recognized that as that his wife and the other sons would be bowing down. So here we have this sun and moon, and the stars come into view in the same way they did in the Genesis narrative. And those 12 stars obviously speak of Israel. They are the faithful of Israel have coming out of the tribulation here that are from the 12 tribes. And this woman is pregnant and cried out, being in labor, about to give birth. Well, of course, this woman giving birth is certainly reminiscent of Galatians 4. Let me just pull that up for you. Galatians 4, Paul speaks of the woman who is our mother, Jerusalem from above, and he makes that distinction between that which is from Mount Sinai, and he likens that to Hagar, the wife of Abraham, the handmaid of Abraham, who bore out of his own strength, he bore Ishmael, and but Isaac was the son of promise, and Paul takes that and makes an allegory out of it and says that Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, his present natural Jerusalem. Then it says that she is in slavery with her children, but the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. So we see this kind of motherhood image of this woman. She's clothed with the sun, she's got the crown, she's got the moon under her feet, means that she's standing victorious over the law, because Christ, the Spirit of life, as Paul speaks in Romans 8, the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has set us free from the law of sin and death. And so this lesser power, this lesser luminary, as we see in Genesis 1, when the moon is spoken of, a lesser luminary. Now, quite a distinction between the moon and the glorious light of Christ and the sun. And so, now, enter the dragon. Another sign appears in the heaven, and behold, in verse 3, that the great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns on his head, were given 7 crowns, and his tail swept away the third of the stars of heaven and hurled them to earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour the child. Now, I think that this is probably an image of the Roman Empire at the time. We'll probably get into this in more detail, some very interesting detail about the Roman Empire and the Caesars and leadership, but it's got 7 heads but 10 horns, and the 7 heads would indicate the ruling Caesars that ruled Rome from the time of Julius through the time of Vespasian. But there's actually 10. It also mentions that the fact that there were 10 heads, and the reason there are 10 heads is because there were 3 interim of rulers, would-be wannabe emperors who vied for power after Nero's death, and so, but they never really took control of the empire. They all died violent deaths. It was a very tumultuous time in Rome when Nero died, and they'd first set the city on fire, and Rome was near collapse, and a lot going on. So we have this extra 3, and we're going to look into a little bit more detail about the importance of understanding that. But right now, we just want to kind of make this distinction that I think it's a good image of Rome, and it also says that he swept away. He swept away a third of the stars of heaven and hurled them to the earth. And so we see this picture. Again, we have a picture here of from Lamentations 2, where in the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC, Jeremiah laments. You have in Lamentations 2:1, he says, "You have cast the glory of Israel from heaven down to earth." And so I think this tail of the dragon would refer to false prophets in Israel and leaders who both were providing a false narrative, a false narrative that I have a text for you. Let me pull that up if I can. I got it in my notes, a little mixed up here right now, but let me just pull it. There it is. It's in Isaiah 9 and 15, and he says that Isaiah. I'll just read it here from my notes in the interest of time. The head is the elder, and the honorable man. The prophet who teaches falsehood is the tail. You notice that there's a prophet. There's a prophetic outlook, a false prophetic voice that is the tail, and that false prophetic voice sweeps. What it's doing is sweeping. The lie is sweeping Israel from her place as a heavenly people. That's the way the Bible describes, Israel of the Old Testament there, and now describes the church. Paul refers to the church as having been raised with Christ into the heavenly places. That was the role of Israel, and Israel is as was spoken in Lamentations, that the glory of Israel as a heavenly people has been thrown down to earth, and we see this again after her resurrection in the Second Temple era and the rebuilding of the temple, as she was restored to glory. Then again, here we have this false narrative, and these false narratives came in 2 different forms. And it says that, and we learn that the false prophets, Jesus said, would cause many to stumble, but there was also a false narrative in Israel where the elite, the societal elite, the Sadducees and the wealthy, the aristocracy, were promoting allegiance to Rome. So neither of these functions were really reflected the truth of God. Okay, one was an anti-Rome and fighting. The other were pro-Rome and encouraging worship and acknowledgement of this beastly empire. And so this false narrative is sweeping. The third, again, may be incidental to the message, or it may have to do with now the focus of the vision, as we saw in Matthew 24, that the focus of the vision moves from an empire-wide vision to something that is more narrowly focused around Jerusalem, and there's some hints to that in this text. And so the tail sweeps away the stars, it hurls them back to the ground, and the dragon stood before the woman who's about to give birth. And so when she gave birth, she might devour the child. And so this is this whole anti-Christian or anti-Christ sentiment that existed in the allegiance between Rome and Israel at the time, who wanted to destroy Jesus. But she gives birth to the child, a son in verse 5, a male who's going to rule the nations with a rod of iron. Of course, that's Jesus. And her child is caught up to God in his throne. Again, we have no mention here of the death of Jesus, because this Jesus who is born in this vision is not Christ of the flesh. He's born of the New Jerusalem. He's not born of Mother Mary, an earthly woman. He's born of the New Jerusalem. Jerusalem, who is our mother. He's the firstborn of many brethren. Okay, as the writer of Hebrews tells us, and in Colossians 1:18, he is the firstborn from the dead. Okay, the firstborn of the new creation. And so this one is the firstborn of a new community of the resurrection, of whom we are. He is that firstborn of many brethren. And this is never to be understood as Christ being the firstborn, is never to be thought of as Jesus having a beginning, as having been the firstborn of God, as if here he were a created being, as some religions teach. There's nothing about Jesus being born of the flesh here. This is the firstborn of the resurrection. Okay, the firstborn of the community of the resurrection, and Jesus is now seen as just ascending right to God and his throne. And so after this happens, the woman flees to the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. So now we see an earthly representation of this mother, this Israelite mother. And I think what we're seeing here, as history bears out, that there was a period of time here in history and during the war when a Roman general had initially surrounded Jerusalem, and for whatever reason, we learned about this earlier in our study in Matthew 24, decided that because of some of the interactions they had had with the rebellion, that he didn't have enough resources, and he turned around with 30,000 men and retreated. And when that happened, the gates were open, the rebels went out after the Roman army, and many fled Jerusalem at that time. And most historians believe that this is when the church actually fled and went to Pella, to establish a community away from Jerusalem, in obedience to what Jesus had told them. Again, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, leave the city, don't go back, don't look back, don't go get your coat, just get out of there, because the door would open quickly and shut quickly. And so many left, and it's pretty well assumed, and probably, and as some historians have acknowledged, that the church fled Jerusalem at that time. And again, here we have some interesting symbolism here, some allusions to some Old Testament reality. The woman flees to the wilderness, and what she's doing is she's leaving spiritual Egypt. Now remember, back in chapter 11, okay, we were told that the dead bodies of the witnesses would lie in the city, the great city, which is spiritually called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified. That's verse 8. So what is Old Jerusalem is spiritually called Sodom and Egypt. And what we see here is the woman, the chosen of God, fleeing spiritual Egypt to go into the wilderness. This is a replay of Exodus 14 and 15 as God prepares a place for her where she would be nourished, okay? And so there's more yet to some Old Testament allusion here in this story, but this is just kind of giving us some ideas of what's going on here. There's this heavenly imagery, but then there's this earthly counterpart that's being seen of a people who belong to God, who are a heavenly Jerusalem. And in this case, I think we're looking at the Jerusalem church, the people that were in Jerusalem, the Christians who fled. And historically, I understand that there is evidence that there had been a Jewish community at one time in Pella. And not much is known of the history of them, except that there were some evidences. And now the scene shifts back into heaven. Again, from earth. We're kind of going back and forth between heaven and earth. And in verse 7, there's a war in heaven. And Michael and his angels are waging war with the dragon. This is all going on in heaven. And the dragon and his angels, it says the angels waged war and did not prevail. There was no longer a place found for the dragon and his angels, and the dragon is thrown down, the serpent of old, who was called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the land, and his angels were thrown down with him. This is an important statement, by the way. I want you to put that in your pocket because later on it's going to be very important. The dragon was thrown down and his angels were thrown down with him. And then I heard a loud voice saying, "Now is the salvation, power, and kingdom of our Lord." What we have here, we'll stop for a moment. We'll come back. We see this imagery of a war in heaven. I believe personally that this war in heaven occurred during this season of this period of time between the death and resurrection of Christ and the destruction of Jerusalem, so that when the devil was thrown down, he indeed had a short time. Now, how does this align with what actually happened when Jesus ascended? The devil who was in heaven had access to the throne because of man's sinfulness, and redemption had not been accomplished. We see this imagery in the book of Zechariah where Satan is at the right hand of the throne, or at the left hand of the throne, and he's bringing accusation against Joshua the high priest. And he wanted this enemy of God wanted the old covenant to remain in force because of the power of the law. Though it was holy, the God's law was holy, it was the enemy's tool. It gave him right to accuse, because all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. So as a prosecutor, he used it as a condemning force over the saints as he stood at God's judgment seat. Now we'll look at this again in a moment in 12:11. This is alluded to in 12:11, where we learn that the saints overcome him, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But now he and his angels are overcome by the host of heaven and thrown down to the land, and I suggested that this war began at Jesus' ascension. Now we think of war like this, all of a sudden, boom, that he went up there and boom, he was thrown out. But this is a war. Something is going on in the heavens during which there's this great trial and turmoil on the earth. There's battles going on, there's warfare going on, there's persecution going on. So there's all this kind of tribulation and war and persecution and all kinds of turmoil going on the earth, and it's reflective of a war that's going on in heaven. Now, why did it begin at Jesus' ascension? This, I think, is important. Because the accuser, after Jesus ascended into the heavens, he could no longer enter the throne room to accuse God's people once Jesus, our high priest, great high priest, cleansed the heavenly tabernacle with his own blood. He went and he cleansed all of that from the stain of sin and the stench of Satan's presence. Now let's get a peek at that in Hebrews 9. So just like Moses, and the writer of Hebrews is telling us, and the writer of Hebrews is making this comparison as the earthly temple, the earthly services, the earthly design is a reflection of merely of what is actually in the heavens, the temple of God in the heavens. And it says that Moses took the blood of the calves and the goats, and he sprinkled the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant which God commanded you." In the same way, he sprinkled the tabernacle, the vessels of ministry with blood. And according to the law, one may almost say that all things are cleansed with blood. And without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness. So he's telling us that Moses had to sprinkle everything, because everything is tainted by man's sin and by the devil's activity, okay? But now look. He goes on to say, "Therefore it was necessary for the copies of these things in the heavens, the copies of those things that are in the heavens, to be cleansed with these. But the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices." Now the heavenly things still had to be cleansed with a better sacrifice, we're told. Okay, "For Christ did not enter a holy place made with hands," like the temple and the tabernacle. Those were a mere copy of the true one, "but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us, now once at the consummation of the ages." And that's what we're seeing here, this consummation of the age. "He has been manifested to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself." You see what's going on here? What the writer of Hebrews is telling us? That Jesus enacted, or Moses was enacting what Christ was going to do. He was going to go into the heavens. He was going to clear the stench of sin and the devil's presence from God's holy tabernacle, God's holy temple in the heavens. And Satan apparently did not like this. He did not like that he was going to be moved out and not able to accuse anymore, because Christ's blood was there as an intercessory force. And the people of God had now been cleansed of their iniquity. Okay, just like we see that forecast of this in Joshua, where the angel of the Lord rebukes the devil and says, I've plucked this guy out of the fire. I've cleansed him by my own prerogative. So get behind me. The Lord rebuke you, Satan. Okay? And so this is kind of what we're seeing. And they're being thrown out of heaven. Do you understand that the devil is not in heaven today, okay, accusing you? Okay, he was thrown out of heaven, and he knows that he only had a short time left. This is a very condensed period. From 30 to 70 AD, he's got this small period where he's left that he's going to work, because we're going to learn later on in Revelation, he's going to be bound. Okay, and so he has no place of accusation then. All right, so now the power and kingdom of God and the authority of Christ have come, and for the accuser of the brethren is thrown down, the one that accuses them before God day and night. And they overcame him, and this is marvelous, they overcome him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto the death. Now this is the believers in the face of persecution, in the face of accusation, in the face of tribulation. They rely on three things, okay? Not guns and swords, okay, that the rebels want them to have. Not reliance upon Rome, that the aristocracy and the Sadducees would want them to trust. No, their trust is in the blood of Christ. They silence the accuser. They silence the dragon because of the blood of Christ that has washed them clean. They silence the accuser with the word of their testimony. What's the word of that testimony? Romans 10 and 9. He says that if you confess that Jesus Christ is Lord and believe in your heart that God's raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. For the mouth confession is made unto salvation. With the heart we believe unto righteousness. And so this confession that Christ is Lord, not the Jewish leaders, not the Roman Caesars, but that Christ is Lord. And he, in fact, is not a dead carpenter from Nazareth, but that he is, in fact, the resurrected, risen Lord. This was their confession. And then finally, they loved not their life unto the death. They understood that their true life was waiting for them beyond the grave, and so they did not need to cling to life in the face of death. What a powerful, powerful testimony God's given us as Christians, if only we could see life through the same lens that these early saints saw it. to strengthen our hearts in the face of adversity. And then in verse 12, he goes on to say that now that the devil has come down, he says, woe, there's rejoicing and there's woe. The church is seen here as those who dwell in heaven that are rejoicing. Again, as in Ephesians 2, as we are told that he has raised us up into heavenly places, okay, in Christ, with Christ in resurrection. And that is our placement as heavenly people. And as heavenly people, there's a rejoicing. But woe to those who are dwelling on the land and the sea. And this, of course, is the Israel and the Roman world, the Roman Empire, as the devil has come down to wreak havoc and turmoil and war and death and plague and destruction in everything that he does. So now we look briefly at verse 13. So as the dragon saw that he was thrown down to earth, as actually I would think is down to the land, because much of the theater of Revelation is the land of Israel, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child, but 2 wings of a great eagle were given to the woman so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place where she was nourished for times and a half a time from the presence of the serpent. Here we have a recap or a revisitation of the woman's flight out into safety, but it is the same imagery that we saw earlier, only this time the Lord quotes, we get the imagery of Israel being taken out of Egypt on eagle's wings. I believe that's Exodus 19, if I'm not mistaken. If I don't have it, I'll get it for you, but I'm pretty sure that was 19. Yeah, well, I don't have the exact text. It just came to mind. That we see Israel again, the flight out of Egypt, where the Lord said, I believe it's Exodus 19, you've seen how I took you out of Egypt on eagle's wings. So again, we have the same allusion to Old Testament Israel, the faithful of Israel, the deliverance being at the wings of a great eagle given to the woman. And again, she's fleeing Egypt. And that Egypt, as we learned in 11, is spiritually the reference to old Israel or old Jerusalem. Now look at this. I love this. She was nurtured for 3.5 years, times and a half a time. That would be again the 3.5 year period. And it says that the serpent hurled water like a river out of his mouth after the woman. And the earth, the land, not the earth, the land drank up which the dragon had hurled out of his mouth. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, went off to make war with the rest of her children who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. What a phenomenal image here. We see this flood coming out of the dragon's mouth. What this is, the land is seen here as a friend of the church. And the land opens up its mouth to receive this flood. The flood is the invasion of the army, as we've already seen numerous times. It's the invasion, the pursuit of an army. And what's happening here is that the Romans are deterred by the war. The war in Israel and the activities and the battles with the rebels that would ensue keep them from being able to pursue the church. So this theater of the conflict in the land is keeping the Romans from being able to chase after the church, the dragon to go after the church, and she flees to safety. And this enraged dragon then goes and he begins to seek out the church in other parts of the empire, the rest of her children. Now, what's so important about that? Well, up until now, we've been seeing the invasion of Israel as if this was all about Israel and the destruction of Israel. But it's not. Okay, that's only one part of this vision. The devil, the dragon, had a real target, and that real target was the church. It's the woman. It's the woman and her children. Okay, the New Jerusalem and all of her children, beginning at Jerusalem, but then throughout the empire. That's the real enemy. That's the real target. is that the devil wants to stop the purpose of God in the church. And we're going to learn more about that as we go on. All right. Later chapters of Revelation, we're going to see that. But what a marvelous, there's just so many interesting images. I hope I did it justice for you, because it can be complex, but there are so many allusions to Old Testament reality as well as history that occurred in the course of that incredible period from 30 to 70 AD that culminated with the great invasion of the city and the destruction of Israel and the launching of a new covenant era for the church. So anyway, I thank you for tuning in. And again, I hope that wasn't too confusing. We'll be revisiting some of these ideas as time goes on. But for now, we're going to close it. Thank you for joining me. God bless you richly.